Magnus Carlsen is the greatest chess player of all time, but in this blitz game versus international master Evgeny Iganov, he completely went off the deep end. He ended up losing his queen in a crazy middle game position, and in the end, he got checkmated in absolutely spectacular fashion. Now, in the game, the challenger, international master Evgeny Iganov, he opens 1d4, and Magnus, in response, goes for the very rare Chigorin variation with d5, c4, knight c6. Already, this is a huge surprise. You almost never see this variation at the highest level, unless your name is Alexander Morozevich. And here, white throws a curveball with the move e4, simply sacrificing the e-pawn. I mean, this is not a good move, but he must have something in mind. He is playing Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus takes, and white goes d5. This is the idea. And the pawn on d5 is hitting the knight on c6, so the knight has to move knight e5. Now, white, queen d4, hitting both the knight and the pawn on e4. And Magnus finds the best move. It looks a little bit crazy, but he goes knight to g6. And the knight on g6 does help support an e5 break, hitting the queen, so the knight is actually very well placed on the g6 square. Now Evgeny Iganov, he shows his big idea, h4. Prince Harry, the h-pawn, has entered the game. White's idea, obviously, is h5, hitting the knight, and maybe even h6 in the future. So now Magnus, e5, hitting the queen, very good central break. Now queen takes e4, knight f6, and queen c2. This is the best retreat square for the queen. Now Magnus, bishop c5, very logical development, clearly the best square for the bishop here. And this is where things get extra spicy. White here pushes Harry the h-pawn up to the h5 square. Oh boy, 97 from Magnus, and is he going to go all the way? He is h6. Oh, we have an alpha zero attack in this game. And in case you haven't heard of that term, the term Alpha Zero attack is named after the computer program Alpha Zero that loved to push the h-pawn all the way up to h6 in almost any kind of position. So the idea is you want to force out g6 from black, but then black has these permanent dark square weaknesses on the king side, and that pawn on h6 is going to be a huge asset late into the game. Now Evgeny, knight c3, he wants to go long castles, so logical move, Magnus castles, and now bishop g5, again preparing long castles on the queen side. And of course this move, bishop g5, does put pressure on that knight on f6, so Magnus has to find a way to deal with the pressure. Now the best move here is actually knight to g4, however Magnus does not find that, instead knight f5 on the board. And from here, white simply castles queenside, and believe it or not, white has an advantage out of the opening against Magnus, despite the insane opening with 3e4, sacrificing that e-pawn. Now Magnus, this is where he starts to go on tilt. I don't know about this next move, b5, attacking on the queen side. Obviously, the idea is he wants to sacrifice a pawn to open up lines against the white king. But oh boy, this is aggressive. Okay, white, he finds the best move, knight to f3, simply ignoring the pawn. Of course, the idea is if Magnus takes on c4, white's going to recapture on e5 with the knight. And believe it or not, that is what happens. The best move here for Magnus is b4, but he doesn't find it. Instead, b takes c4 on the board. And here, the international master punishes Magnus Carlsen with the move knight takes e5. Oh boy, the threat is simply knight c6, and that knight is going to be a monster on that square. Now Magnus, the best defensive resource is bishop to b7. That way, if white ever goes knight to c6, black can simply chop off that knight. However, Magnus, this is not his day. Instead, he goes knight to d4, jumping in with the knight and attacking white's queen. Now, of course, the problem with this is white does not have to move the queen. Instead, he can simply sacrifice the rook on d4. Then after bishop takes, go knight to c6. And as we see, that wasn't really a rook sacrifice, as now white is threatening both the queen on d8 and that bishop on the d4 square. Oh no, this is not good at all for our hero Magnus Carlsen. Now, of course, Magnus has some tricks up his sleeve. Instead of moving the queen here, he goes bishop to f5, simply hitting the white queen on c2. And as we can see, both players' queens are hanging in this position. Wow, that is a lot of tension. Now, from here, the best move for white is simply queen to d2, getting the queen out of the attack and also supporting that bishop on g5. However, instead of d2, white goes queen d1. And obviously, the problem is that queen does not support the bishop on the g5 square from d1. Okay, let's see if Magnus can capitalize on that. He starts bishop takes c3. He does what? The queen's under attack. Magnus goes bishop takes c3. He decides the best plan of action is to lose the queen on d8. Oh boy, what is Magnus going to do here? He goes rook b8 immediately instead of recapturing on d8. The idea is he's threatening rook takes b2, and obviously white cannot go b takes c3 because then rook b1 check, pinning the king and the queen. For example, b takes c3, rook b1 with the x-ray on the king, And here Magnus would have a huge advantage, so obviously white does not do that. Instead, the best move, b3 on the board. Now Magnus takes on b3, white takes back, and here the best defensive resource is simply taking that knight on the d8 square. However, Magnus is in a fighting mood. He jumps forward with the knight to the e4 square, and of course the idea is you are hitting that bishop on g5. However, Evgeny Igorov is not phased. Instead, he goes knight to c6, simply attacking the rook on b8 instead of defending. And now here, things again just go completely nuts. Magnus takes on g5. The most obvious move is simply knight takes b8, but Evgeny does not do that. Instead, knight e7 check. Oh my goodness, what's the idea? Well, the king is obviously forced back to the h8 square. He can't go king g7 because of the pawn on h6. So king h8 on the board. Now knight takes f5, e takes... and finally, queen c2. So overall, white's idea is he wanted to damage black's pawn structure, and to him, that was more important than winning the rook on the b8 square. Now Magnus bishop d4, and here Evgeny goes for a very solid idea, f3, simply taking away the e4 square for the knight. Now Magnus rook e8, activating the rook on the e-file, and Evgeny goes for the very creative idea, rook h4, activating the rook on the 4th rank to attack the bishop. Now Magnus rook e1 check, obviously king b2 not an option, so white goes king d2. And the king looks kind of strange on the d2 square, but it is quite safe there. Now Magnus rook b to e8, doubling up on the e-file and defending the rook on e1. Of course, it was being attacked by the king. But now Evgeny, he simply takes the bishop on d4. And yes, the bishop on f1 is hanging, but suddenly Evgeny is going to bring his queen and his rook over into the attack. This is bad for Magnus. And that's what happens. Rook takes f1, queen takes f5, and here Evgeny is simply threatening mate in 2. Queen f6, king g8, queen g7, checkmate. So what is Magnus going to do? Rook f2, delivering a check, king d3, and now there are no more checks. Magnus takes on g2, trying to defend along the g-file, but it is too little too late. Queen f6, king g8, and the final blow, queen g7, checkmate. Magnus doesn't even get the chance to resign. He gets checkmated in the end. Wow, what a game. Now, if you enjoyed this video, go and subscribe to my channel and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I will see you in the next video.